The Emperor of the Romans is on his knees in the dirt. His imperial purple robes are shredded, his face caked in blood and dust. The man standing over him is not a Roman general, but Alp Arslan, the Sultan of the Seljuk Turks. How did the most powerful man on earth end up here, his entire army shattered around him? The answer isn't a simple defeat. It's a story of betrayal so profound it would ignite a century of holy war and reshape our world forever. This is the story of that emperor, Romanos, the fourth Diogenes, a soldier on a throne of snakes. Back in the great palace of Constantinople, a city of 1 million people and 1 million secrets, he was always an outsider. Picture the scene, the throne room, vast and shimmering with gold mosaics, the air thick with incense and conspiracy. It's filled with men in robes of purple silk, the ancient noble families, the civil bureaucrats led by the powerful Ducas clan. These were men whose power came from ink and whispers, from ancient bloodlines and carefully guarded influence. And they looked upon the man on the throne with a barely veiled contempt. Romanos was a product of the rugged Anatolian frontier, a man whose hands were calloused from holding a sword, not a scepter. He smelled of leather and steel, not perfumed oils. He had won his crown through a strategic marriage to the widowed Empress Eudokia, a move that made him the guardian of the empire, but not a true member of their exclusive club. He could feel their disdain in the cold formalities, see it in the flicker of their eyes as they bowed. He knew his power was temporary, resting on a knife's edge. He had risen on a single promise, that he, a soldier, could secure the empire's bleeding borders. A single defeat, a single sign of weakness, would be all the invitation his rivals needed to declare him incompetent, to depose him and cast his infant sons aside. He needed a victory, not just a minor skirmish, but a triumph so grand, so absolute, that it would forge a legacy in steel and permanently silence the vipers in his own court. But the victory he sought would come at a cost he could never have imagined. His chance and his doom was gathering like a storm in the east. The 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire, the heir to the glory of Rome, was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. In the same year, its last bastion in Italy had fallen to the Normans, a sign of its weakening grip on the west. But the more grievous wound, the one that threatened to be fatal, was in Anatolia. This vast peninsula was the empire's heartland, the source of its food, wealth, and its toughest soldiers. Now, it was being systematically ravaged. Imagine a provincial governor, his face lined with exhaustion, dictating a desperate message to a scribe. He speaks of villages burned to ash, the stench of smoke hanging in the air for weeks, of fields of wheat, the empire's breadbasket, trampled into dust, of entire garrisons slaughtered to the last man. The culprits were the Seljuk Turks. They were not an army that could be met in a set-piece battle. They were a force of nature. Their nomadic warriors would sweep across the border in bands of a few hundred or a few thousand, moving with the speed of the wind, striking deep into the empire before melting back into the eastern steppes. To the farmers of Anatolia, they were ghosts on horseback, a relentless plague that left behind only smoke, fear, and a stream of desperate refugees fleeing west toward the capital with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Romanos, the soldier emperor, believed he had the only answer to such a foe, overwhelming, undeniable force. He would not play their game of raids and retreats. He would gather an army so massive it would shake the very earth as it marched. He would march east, find the Sultan, and in one glorious battle, crush the Seljuk threat into dust. The call went out, and the response was a spectacle of monumental might. From the Balkans came Slavic infantry, their faces grim and hard. From the north, the giants of the Varangian Guard, axe-wielding warriors of Viking stock, whose loyalty was legendary, bought and paid for with mountains of imperial gold. To swell the numbers, Romanos emptied the treasury, hiring thousands of mercenaries. Frankish and Norman heavy knights, encased in steel, masters of the devastating charge, Armenian infantry, and even nomadic Turkic horsemen, warriors whose loyalties were dangerously fluid. It was a spectacular, chaotic host of perhaps 70,000 men, a rolling city of nations, speaking a dozen different languages. Its supply train alone stretched for miles, with thousands of carts, mules, and camp followers. As it marched out of Constantinople, its glittering armor and 1,000 banners were a sight of awesome power. But Romanos, in his single-minded quest for glory, had made one fatal mistake. He had put his most bitter political rival in charge of his reserves, a decision that would seal the fate of an empire. Far from the marble halls of Constantinople, a different kind of leader held court in a silk tent. His name was Alp Arslan, the heroic lion, the second sultan of the great Seljuk Empire. He was a brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ruthless commander, a man forged in the crucible of tribal warfare, who had personally carved out a massive empire across Persia and Mesopotamia. Where Romanos was insecure, Alp Arslan was the undisputed master of his own destiny. He was known for his piety, but also for a temper that could fell a man with a single glare, inspiring a fanatical loyalty in his emirs and warriors that was his greatest weapon. His army was a reflection of him, smaller, faster, and far deadlier. At around 40,000 strong, it was a cohesive killing machine of Turkoman horse archers. These men were born in the saddle, their composite bows an extension of their arms. Made from layers of wood, sinew, and horn, these weapons were incredibly powerful, capable of piercing Byzantine armor at a distance. A Turkoman warrior's training began in childhood. By the time he was a man, he could fire a dozen arrows in a minute, control his hardy steppe pony with his knees, and reload his bow, all while riding at a full gallop. Their strategy was a lethal dance. They would never engage in a head-on clash with heavy infantry. Instead, they would swarm an enemy like a pack of wolves harassing a great bear, feigning retreat to goad ponderous knights into a reckless, exhausting chase. Then, when their pursuers were disorganized and gasping for breath, they would suddenly turn, encircle them in their famous crescent moon trap, and cut them to pieces from a distance. This was not a battle of brute force. It was the art of the kill, perfected on the vast, unforgiving plains of Central Asia. They were the perfect killing machine, and their leader, Alp Arslan, was about to get the surprise of his life. The great irony of Manzikert is that the battle was never supposed to happen. Alp Arslan was not focused on Byzantium. His strategic goal, his holy war, was aimed south, against the rival Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. In the spring of 1071, he was deep in Syria, planning the siege of Aleppo, when a series of exhausted scouts arrived, their horses lathered in sweat. They brought shocking news. The Byzantine emperor was not on a border patrol. He was leading a colossal army of invasion directly toward the Seljuk heartlands. Alp Arslan was caught completely by surprise. In a move of sheer audacity and strategic genius, he left a small part of his army in Syria and, gathering his elite cavalry, began a brutal, desperate forced march north. Day and night they rode, crossing mountains and deserts, pushing their hardy steppe ponies to the limits of endurance. It was a race against time. As the slow, heavy Byzantine force lumbered across Anatolia, the Sultan's smaller, faster army was closing in like a hunting wolf. He was heavily outnumbered, but he was on terrain of his choosing, and he held the element of surprise. And he knew a fatal secret about the emperor's army that Romanos himself refused to see. The heroic lion was ready to spring his trap. If you appreciate learning about these pivotal moments that shaped our world, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps us bring more of these incredible stories to light. On paper, the emperor's army was the grandest of the age, but it was a coalition, not a unified force. Its fatal flaw was not in its steel, but in the hearts of its commanders. Its ranks were filled with unreliable mercenaries, including Turkic horsemen who were cousins to the very enemy they were paid to fight. But the most dangerous threat was not a foreign mercenary. It was from the very heart of the Byzantine nobility. Marching at the rear of the army, in command of the entire 20,000-man reserve force, was Andronikos Doukas. He was the son of the emperor's most powerful rival in the capital. The Doukas family represented the old, aristocratic power, and they believed the throne belonged to them. They saw Romanos not just as a political opponent, but as a vulgar upstart, a threat to their entire way of life. A glorious victory for the soldier emperor would cement his dynasty and extinguish their own ambitions forever. Andronikos was not marching to help his emperor win. He was a political assassin in a general's cloak, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This internal rot was magnified by the emperor's own arrogance. He was a general who thought in terms of numbers and brute strength, deaf to the subtle poisons of politics. In a council of war, his most experienced generals likely advised caution, warning him of the dangers of the terrain, of the enemy's unorthodox tactics, of stretching their supply lines so thin. But Romanos, blinded by pride and desperately needing a spectacular victory, would have none of it. Confident in his overwhelming numbers, he made a disastrous strategic error. He split his army, sending 20,000 of his best mercenaries, including his Frankish heavy cavalry, on a separate mission to raid a nearby city. He had just weakened his main force by nearly a third, a foolish gamble based on the assumption that the Sultan was still hundreds of miles away. The long, grueling march across the Anatolian plateau had already taken its toll. The army was tired, its supply lines were stretched thin, and the simmering resentments between the factions were boiling over. When the Byzantine vanguard finally arrived on the plains near Manzikert, they easily scattered a small Seljuk patrol. Taking this as a sign of Seljuk weakness, Romanos captured the fortress and allowed his army to disperse to forage. The lion was watching the eagle stumble into its lair, and he had just made the single biggest mistake of his life, with no idea the enemy was already in the hills, watching him. The trap was now set. On the morning of Friday, August 26th, 1071, the mighty Byzantine war machine rolled forward in a long, glittering line of steel. But the Seljuks would not fight the battle Romanos wanted. For hours, their horse archers simply melted away, peppering the dense legions with a relentless storm of arrows. The sound was a terrifying, high-pitched shriek, like a million angry hornets, as men began to fall, their frustration mounting. The heat of the August sun beat down on their heavy armor. Thirst became a torment. This wasn't a battle. It was a slow, agonizing execution by 1,000 cuts. As evening approached, Romanos, exhausted and demoralized, made the correct military decision. He ordered a disciplined withdrawal back to camp. It was at this precise moment of transition, the most vulnerable for any army, that the trap sprung. Seeing the Byzantines turn their backs, Alp Arslan unleashed his entire force in a great, thundering charge, slamming into the flanks and rear of the disorganized Byzantine line. And then, at the moment of maximum chaos, the ultimate betrayal unfolded. Andronikos Doukas, in command of the reserves, deliberately spread the rumor that the emperor had fallen and the battle was lost. Then, in a shocking act of treason, he turned the entire 20,000-man reserve force around and marched them off the battlefield, leaving their emperor and their comrades to their fate. The act was so brazen that it shattered what remained of Byzantine morale. Panic turned to rout. The Turkic mercenaries defected, attacking their former employers. The Byzantine army dissolved into chaos. Its loyal center, with the emperor and his Varangian guard, was now completely surrounded, an island of courage in a sea of betrayal. The great crescent moon had finally closed. What do you think was the most critical factor in the Byzantine defeat? Romanos's arrogance, Alp Arslan's genius, or the shocking betrayal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The fighting at the center had been apocalyptic. Romanos and his Varangian guard, knowing they were doomed, had formed a circle and fought with the fury of cornered lions, the sound of their great axes cleaving through shields, echoing across the plain. They fought until the emperor himself, his horse killed from under him, fought on foot, sword in hand, until he was wounded and overwhelmed. The emperor of the Romans, his imperial purple robes torn and stained with blood, was dragged from a hiding place and thrown at the feet of the Sultan. The scene that followed has become the stuff of legend. Alp Arslan, struggling to believe the bloodied, dust-covered man was the mighty emperor, reportedly asked, "What would you have done if I were brought before you as a prisoner?" Romanos, with grim honesty, replied, "Perhaps I'd kill you or exhibit you in the streets of Constantinople." Alp Arslan's response was not what he expected. "My punishment is far heavier," the Sultan said. "I forgive you and set you free." Alp Arslan, the victor, showed the emperor mercy, but his own people showed him none. Romanos was released and returned home, not to a parade, but to a civil war. The Doukas family, led by the traitor's father, had used his defeat to seize the throne. He was hunted as an enemy of the state, and after a brief, brutal struggle, he was captured. His enemies enacted their final, cruel revenge. The soldier emperor, the man who had gambled everything for the glory of Rome, was publicly blinded with a hot iron. He died days later from his infected wounds, an exile in his own land. His tragic death broke the treaty he had made with the Sultan. With no emperor to enforce it, and no Byzantine army left to defend the border, the dam broke. The Seljuk victory, intended only to be a sharp lesson, accidentally became an open invitation. Turkic tribes began to pour into Anatolia unopposed. It was not a coordinated invasion, but a massive, unstoppable migration that would forever change the land's culture and faith. The empire had lost its heartland. This single betrayal on a dusty field didn't just kill an emperor, it lit the fuse for a century of holy war. A desperate new emperor in Constantinople, watching the Turks advance to the very shores opposite the capital, would send a plea for help to the Pope in Rome, a plea that would be twisted into a call to arms, unleashing the First Crusade. The Battle of Manzikert didn't just open the gates of Anatolia, it opened a new and bloody chapter in the history of the world. If you found this story of ambition, betrayal, and world-changing consequences as fascinating as we did, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates epic history. Thank you for joining us on this journey back in time. To ensure you don't miss our next exploration of the incredible battles and forgotten stories that shaped our world, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. We look forward to seeing you again.